Welcome to our study of 2 Kings. 2 Kings is about how Yahweh deports Israel and Judah into captivity because of their idolatrous ways and rejection of His messengers. 1st and 2nd Kings gives no explicit evidence for authorship. The Jewish tradition, as contained in the Babylonian Talmud, suggests that Jeremiah was the author. Some have argued that the similarities between Jeremiah 52 and 2 Kings 24 and 25 support the notion of Jeremiah as the author. We know that there was a tradition of the prophets keeping written records. The prophets are given prominence in these books, which would further argue for a prophetic influence by the authorship. 2 Kings spans the period from the reign of Ahaziah to the release of King Jehoiachin in Babylon from 553 down to 560 BC. The nation was a divided monarchy and transitioned to a puppet monarchy. The book begins with Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and Judah, the 2 southern tribes, in civil war, and concludes with the nations in exile. The book opens with the major cities of Jerusalem, Bethel, and Dan vying for the people's worship and alliance and allegiance and money for that matter. The book ends with the people being forced to worship the foreign gods of the Assyrians and Babylonians. 1st and 2nd Kings were probably written throughout the period of the United Monarchy to the Babylonian exile, a period from 971 down to 586 BC. There are 2 references in 1 Kings that demonstrate that the book was written over a period of time. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 8 speaks of the existence of the ark in the inner sanctuary to this day, which would not have been true at the close of 2 Kings. 1 Kings 12:19 states that Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day, which would not have been true at the close of 2 Kings. These passages show that 1st and 2nd Kings were written throughout the period and then finalized after the Babylonian captivity as one document. Since there was no reference to the decree of King Cyrus of Persia that allowed the Hebrews to return to Jerusalem, the final composition was completed prior to 539 BC. Since 2 Kings concludes with the release of Jehoiachin, the final form would probably have been completed shortly after 560 BC. Since 1st and 2nd Kings appear to have been written by a prophet over the period of these years, the first recipients were probably the Israelites living during the transition from the united to the divided monarchies, 971 down to 722 BC. The final form of 1st and 2nd Kings would have been given to the nation in exile or the people in exile, since it closes with historical accounts of 3 Babylonian deportations. This time of history was a period of transition not only for Israel nationally, but for the Middle East internationally. During the Solomonic reign, Israel ruled militarily, socially, and economically. Solomon had established his military presence throughout the trade routes, resulting in his control of international business and politics. Egypt was weak and under the dominance of Israel. The many sins of Solomon led to civil war and national apostasy. The Lord God, or Yahweh Elohim, raised up Assyria in 722 BC, and then Babylon, or the Babylonians, from 605 to 586 BC, to punish Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and then Judah, the 2 southern tribes, for their sins, primarily of idolatry and immorality. The major argument for Kings is Israel's degeneration and judgment into exile happens because of its idolatrous kings and apostate people. But it is delayed by Yahweh's gracious work in a few godly prophets and kings. A major purpose is to show the exiled and chastised people that the success or failure of the kingdom depends on the obedience of the king and people to Yahweh's laws and covenants. Some key verses are 2 Kings 17, 22 and 23. It states, "And the sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them, until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, as he spoke through all his servants the prophets. So Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day." Some major themes are: Judah is not destroyed for the sake of the Davidic covenant, the prophetic ministry and the importance of the grace that was dispensed through that to the nation, death and resurrection, healings over diseases, the high places of idolatry and immorality, the contrast between kings, God's fulfillment of his promises, and you will discover additional themes as you read 2 Kings. An exegetical outline of 2 Kings can be divided into two major sections. The first section is about the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah from chapters 1 through 17. In these chapters we read of the evil reign of Ahaziah over Israel, how Elijah transfers his prophetic ministry to Elisha, Elisha's prophetic ministry during the evil reign of Jehoram over Judah. Then there is a long list of evil reigns of many kings over Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and then Judah, the 2 southern tribes. The righteous reign of a few kings in Judah provided them an extended existence and some periods of peace. The second section deals with the kingdom of Judah, chapters 18 through 25. In these chapters we read about the righteous reign of Hezekiah over Judah during the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. We read of the evil reign of Manasseh over Judah, the evil and idolatrous reign of Ammon over Judah, the righteous reign of Josiah over Judah, the continuous evil reign of many Judean kings, which brought upon the judgment of God. We see that Nebuchadnezzar invades Jerusalem and takes the people into exile to Babylon. Now let's put our feet into the sands of time so that we may read or listen to the history of Israel's transition from a divided kingdom to a surviving kingdom and then on into Babylonian captivity. The northern kingdom of Israel has had 20 kings, and everyone did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. The southern kingdom of Judah had 19 kings. 11 were evil and 8 were good to varying degrees. The nation has spiritually collapsed into idolatry and apostasy. The judgment of the Lord God has sent the 10 northern tribes into Assyrian captivity and the 2 southern tribes into Babylonian captivity. The preserving influence and grace of prophets like Elijah and Elisha is now gone. You are living in a foreign land under foreign dominance. You and your family have been carried off into exile after a brutal invasion. You are surrounded by foreign gods and foreign temples. You are wondering, where is God? What has happened to your covenant nation of Israel? Has God forsaken his people? You must read to understand why the Lord God has judged his people, your people. You want to learn how the obedience or disobedience of the kings and priests and people has brought consequences on the nation. God has been faithful to Israel by providing prophets and good kings to rebuke the people. The people have been unfaithful and rebellious as they have rejected the prophets and good kings. And ultimately, they have rejected Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God. You must keep the faith while you are in exile. Someday you will be allowed to return to the land, and you want your family to know how to remain in a covenant relationship with the Lord God so that you can prosper spiritually and economically under the blessings of the Lord.